On September 14, 1974, 11 men walked into an illegal poker game in rural Mississippi. None of them walked out alive. What happened inside that converted tobacco warehouse over 6 brutal hours would become known as the most calculated act of vengeance in Delta history. 2 brothers, pushed beyond all reasonable limits, decided that when the law fails to protect decent people, blood becomes the only currency that matters. If you're ready to hear this story of honor, betrayal, and the terrible price of justice, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this is not a tale for the faint of heart. What you're about to witness is how ordinary men become monsters when the system they trusted turns its back on everything they hold sacred. The Mississippi Delta in 1974 was a land caught between 2 worlds. The old ways of farming and family honor still held sway in small communities scattered across endless cotton fields, while modern corruption crept through the cracks like poison ivy. Yazoo County stretched across nearly 1,000 square miles of flat farmland, home to about 27,000 souls who lived by codes their grandfathers had brought from the old country. In this world, a handshake still meant something. Your word was your bond, and when someone violated that sacred trust, the consequences could be swift and merciless. This is the story of what happens when those ancient codes collide with modern greed, when legal theft masquerades as legitimate business, and when 2 brothers decide that some debts can only be paid in blood. James Lee Carter stood 6 feet 1 inch tall that September, though the weight of recent events had aged him beyond his 34 years. His hands bore the permanent scars of a man who worked with machinery and barbed wire, while a thin white line through his left eyebrow served as a reminder of Vietnam, where shrapnel had missed ending his life by less than an inch. He'd returned from that war with a purple heart, nightmares he never discussed, and an unshakable belief that honor meant everything in a world that seemed increasingly determined to prove him wrong. Every morning, James woke before dawn in the farmhouse his grandfather had built with his own hands in 1923. He'd make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, sit on the back porch watching the sun rise over soybean fields that had fed his family for 3 generations, and smoke 2 cigarettes while planning his day. He was a man of routine, of discipline forged in combat and hardened by years of honest labor. But in September of 1974, that routine was being tested by circumstances that would have broken lesser men. His father, Samuel Carter, lay dying in Yazoo County Hospital, his lungs destroyed by 43 years of breathing cotton dust at the local gin. Each breath was a struggle, each day a battle against the inevitable. And now, medical bills were consuming everything the family had managed to save across decades of careful living. Robert Franklin Carter, known to everyone as Bobby, was 5 years younger than his brother, but had always followed James with the kind of loyalty that only exists between siblings who faced hardship together. At 29, Bobby was stockier than James, with thick forearms built from years turning wrenches at Johnson's garage. He had a quick smile and an even quicker temper, though he rarely showed the latter unless someone threatened his family. Bobby lived 2 miles from the family farm with his wife Rita and their 3-year-old son Samuel Jr., called Sammy. The boy was the light of Bobby's world, a child who still believed his daddy could fix anything, solve any problem, make everything right with just a hug and a promise. That innocent faith would soon be tested in ways no child should ever have to endure. The Carter brothers shared one crucial trait beyond blood. They both believed in the old ways, the codes that said a man protects what's his, pays his debts, and keeps his word regardless of the cost. These weren't just ideals to them. They were the foundation upon which their entire worldview rested. When that foundation cracked, everything else would come tumbling down. In the summer of 1974, that foundation began to show its first hairline fractures. Samuel Carter had been forced to borrow money against the family land, 180 acres of prime Delta soil that had been in the Carter name since 1919. The medical bills were crushing him, and the banks weren't interested in helping a dying man with no steady income. That's when Lester Haynes appeared, offering salvation with a smile and a handshake. Everyone called him Lucky, and he wore that nickname like a badge of honor. Lucky Haynes was 41 years old that September, a man who'd never worked an honest day in his life and seemed proud of that fact. He dressed too well for Yazoo County, favoring polyester suits in shades of brown and tan, wide-collar shirts that screamed used car salesman, and platform shoes that added 2 inches to his modest height. Gold rings adorned every finger, and he reeked of English leather cologne applied with the subtlety of a man who needed everyone to notice him. Lucky ran the biggest underground poker game in 3 counties, operating out of Turner's Warehouse on County Road 49 every Saturday night. It wasn't his building, but he organized everything, invited the players, handled the money, and took his percentage off the top. More importantly, he had connections to people who ensured the local law looked the other way. In a world where sheriff's deputies made less than $7,000 a year, Lucky's monthly contributions bought him all the protection he needed. But Lucky Haynes was more than just a gambling operator. He was a predator who specialized in finding desperate people and offering them solutions that always seemed too good to be true. When Samuel Carter came to him needing money for medical bills, Lucky saw opportunity wearing the face of a dying old man who couldn't read legal documents worth a damn. The loan seemed simple enough on the surface. $8,500 at 15% interest, due in 12 months. The family land would serve as collateral, but Lucky assured Samuel this was just a formality, something the lawyers required. No way would it ever come to losing the property. After all, Lucky said with that salesman's smile, men who played poker together looked out for each other. In rural Mississippi, that kind of assurance still meant something. Samuel Carter signed papers he didn't understand, trusting a man in a cheap suit who smelled like discount cologne. It was a decision that would cost him everything he'd spent a lifetime building and set in motion a chain of events that would leave 11 families shattered beyond repair. For 18 months, Samuel made his payments religiously, even as the medical bills continued mounting and his condition worsened. But Lucky had structured the loan with terms that made failure inevitable. When Samuel couldn't meet an impossible payment schedule, when the hospital demanded money the family didn't have, when the weight of debt finally crushed an honest man's ability to keep up, the legal machinery Lucky had set in motion began to turn. On Friday, September 6, 1974, Samuel Carter received a letter from a law office in Jackson. Official letterhead, legal language that required reading 3 times to understand, but the meaning was crystal clear. The Carter family land, all 180 acres, had been transferred to Lester C. Haynes as payment for a debt of $12,300. The transfer was legal, recorded, and final. James found his father in the kitchen that afternoon, clutching the letter like it was a death sentence, his face the color of old newspaper. The oxygen tank that helped him breathe hissed beside him, but Samuel wasn't using it. He couldn't seem to catch his breath, his chest heaving like a broken engine trying to start. "They're taking it," Samuel wheezed through lips that had gone blue. "They're taking everything." Within hours, Samuel Carter was in the hospital, victim of a heart attack brought on by the devastating news that his trust had been betrayed, his legacy stolen, his family's future destroyed by a man he considered a friend. As he lay in that hospital bed, tubes and machines keeping him alive, Samuel told his sons the whole ugly truth about Lucky Haynes and the legal theft that had been perpetrated with a handshake and a smile. That night, sitting in the hospital parking lot until well past midnight, James and Bobby Carter made a decision that would transform them from farmers into something far darker. The law had failed them. The system they'd trusted had been turned into a weapon against them. If legal channels couldn't deliver justice, then justice would have to be delivered through other means. Lucky Haynes had made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed that destroying Samuel Carter would be the end of it, that broken old men simply accepted their fate and faded away quietly. What he hadn't counted on was that Samuel Carter had raised 2 sons who believed honor was worth dying for, and more importantly, worth killing for. Killing for. The investigation that would consume the next 5 days began not with FBI agents or state police, but with 2 brothers who understood that when the system fails, a man must become his own system of justice. James Carter had learned patience in Vietnam. the kind of cold discipline that separates survivors from casualties. Now he would apply those lessons to a different kind of warfare, one fought not in jungle clearings, but in the familiar territory of his own backyard. Bobby Carter possessed a different set of skills, equally valuable for what lay ahead. 3 years working at Johnson's garage had taught him how machines operated, how systems functioned, and most importantly, how they could be made to malfunction when necessary. Where James planned with military precision, Bobby provided the mechanical expertise that would make their plan possible. The first weapon they acquired was information. In rural Mississippi, secrets had a way of traveling faster than gossip, and the Carter brothers had grown up knowing which doors to knock on when questions needed answers. They learned that Lucky Haynes kept detailed records of his poker games, not out of honesty, but from paranoia. A man who lived by cheating others always feared being cheated himself. They discovered that Deputy Marcus Webb had been taking monthly payments from Lucky for over 2 years, ensuring that Saturday night games ran without interference from law enforcement. Webb was 42 years old, married with 2 teenage daughters, and supplemented his meager deputy's salary by looking the other way when certain activities occurred in his jurisdiction. His presence at the poker games wasn't coincidental, but contractual. The warehouse where Lucky ran his operation had been abandoned by legitimate business for 6 years. Horace Turner had stopped growing tobacco in 1968, unable to compete with corporate farming operations that were swallowing small producers across the Delta. The building sat on County Road 49, far enough from town to avoid casual observation, but close enough to major roads for easy access. Perfect for activities that required privacy and quick exits. James spent 3 days studying the warehouse layout, timing traffic patterns, measuring distances to the nearest neighbor. The building had one main room where the games took place, a back door that provided secondary access, and windows too high and too small for anyone to escape through quickly. Once inside, the only ways out were through doors that could be controlled by men who understood tactical positioning. The psychological pressure of watching his father die, while knowing justice would never come through legal channels, had transformed James Carter from a man who solved problems with tools into someone who viewed human obstacles as mechanical failures requiring permanent repair. The change wasn't sudden, but gradual, like metal cooling after being forged, hardening into something that could cut through anything placed before it. Bobby felt the same transformation taking hold, though his came wrapped in the desperate love of a father who couldn't bear the thought of his son growing up in a world where good men got crushed while predators prospered. 3-year-old Sammy deserved better than inheriting a legacy of stolen land and broken promises. If protecting that boy's future required becoming something terrible, then terrible was what Bobby Carter would become. On Tuesday morning, September 10th, James drove alone to Vicksburg, 50 miles south of Yazoo County. Distance provided anonymity, and anonymity provided opportunity. The pawn shop on Washington Street smelled like gun oil and desperation, its fluorescent lights casting everything in sickly yellow shadows that seemed appropriate for the transaction he was about to complete. Behind the counter, a man with tattooed forearms and suspicious eyes watched James examine a 1911 Colt pistol, Korean War surplus, but well-maintained. The weight felt familiar in James's hands, muscle memory from military training flickering back to life like a pilot light touched by gas. $200 cash, plus ammunition, plus the paperwork that would create a trail leading directly back to him if anyone cared to look. But James Carter was past caring about consequences. The man who'd worried about tomorrow had died in that hospital parking lot 5 days earlier, replaced by something focused entirely on the immediate problem of making Lucky Haynes pay for what he'd stolen. If that meant leaving evidence, if that meant ensuring capture, then so be it. Justice was more important than freedom. Wednesday brought the visit to Samuel Carter's hospital bed, where the old man lay surrounded by machines that beeped and hissed like mechanical insects, feeding on whatever life remained in his failing body. Samuel's face had the grey pallor of approaching death, but his eyes remained clear enough to recognize the change in his eldest son's expression. "Don't do nothing stupid," Samuel whispered through the oxygen mask that covered half his weathered face. "The land ain't worth dying over." The words came out muffled but unmistakable, carrying the weight of a father's desperate love for sons who'd already moved beyond his ability to protect them. James took his father's hand, feeling how fragile the once strong fingers had become, how the skin had grown thin and translucent like paper that might tear at the slightest pressure. "I'm not going to die, Daddy." The promise came easily because James meant every word. Death wasn't the plan. Prison was acceptable, even expected. But death would prevent him from ensuring that Lucky Haynes faced full accountability for what he'd done. Samuel's grip tightened with surprising strength, the last reserves of a man who'd spent 70 years building something meaningful and watched it disappear in a single afternoon. "I know that look," he said, his voice barely audible above the mechanical symphony keeping him alive. "Saw it on my own daddy's face once, years ago when the bank tried to foreclose during the Depression. Man gets that look, people end up in the ground." The conversation that followed would haunt James Carter for the rest of his life. Samuel asked him to keep Bobby out of whatever he was planning, to protect the younger brother who had a wife and child depending on him. James promised to try, knowing even as he spoke the words that Bobby had already made his own choice and wouldn't be deterred by promises to a dying man. That evening, Bobby arrived at the farmhouse carrying a bottle of bourbon and the kind of grim determination that comes from watching everything you've believed in crumble around you. They sat on the back porch where they'd spent countless evenings as children, listening to their father tell stories about the grandfather who'd homesteaded the land they were about to lose forever. The conversation was brief because both brothers understood that words couldn't change what needed to be done. Bobby had brought his hunting rifle, a .30-06 that had taken deer for 15 years, and would now be asked to take human life. James had acquired the pistol, plus a shotgun borrowed from their cousin Raymond, who'd asked no questions because family didn't question family when trouble was brewing. 3 weapons, 2 men, 1 target that had multiplied into however many people would be present at Saturday night's poker game. The mathematics were simple enough. Everyone who knew what Lucky Haynes had done to their family, everyone who'd sat at his table while he bragged about acquiring prime farmland for pennies on the dollar, everyone who'd laughed at the destruction of decent people, would face the same fate as the man who'd orchestrated it all. By Thursday evening, the plan had crystallized into something both brothers could execute without hesitation. They would arrive at Turner's warehouse during the peak of Saturday night's game, when all the regular players would be present. They would control the exits, eliminate resistance, and ensure that every person who'd participated in their family's humiliation understood the price of such participation. The final preparation came Friday morning, when James called in sick to the construction job he'd been working, and Bobby arranged for coverage at the garage. They spent the day cleaning weapons, checking ammunition, and driving the routes they would use Saturday night. Everything had to be perfect because there would be no second chances, no opportunity to correct mistakes once the shooting started. Friday evening brought the last normal conversation the Carter brothers would ever share, sitting on that familiar porch as the sun disappeared behind soybean fields that would soon belong to someone else. They talked about childhood memories, about fishing trips and hunting seasons, about the time Bobby had broken his arm falling from the oak tree that still shaded the house their grandfather had built with his own hands. Neither man spoke about what would happen the next night, because both understood that talking about it would only make the waiting harder. Instead, they focused on what they were protecting, the legacy they were trying to preserve, the principle that decent men don't simply accept destruction without fighting back. When darkness finally claimed the Delta, they went inside to prepare for the last normal sleep either would ever experience as free men. Saturday dawned clear and hot, the kind of September morning that promised temperatures in the high 80s by afternoon. James woke at his usual time, made his usual coffee, sat in his usual spot on the porch smoking his usual cigarettes. Everything the same as always, except for the weapons wrapped in canvas on the kitchen table and the knowledge that by Sunday morning 11 men would be dead and the Carter brothers would be either captured or killed themselves. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made the Delta air feel thick as cotton batting. By 8 o'clock, the temperature had only dropped to 76 degrees, and the moisture hung so heavy you could almost see it shimmering above the asphalt like heat mirages. James Carter sat in his pickup truck, engine ticking as it cooled, hands steady on the steering wheel as he watched Turner's warehouse through the gathering dusk. Light leaked through cracks in the weathered siding, and the sound of men's voices carried across the still evening air. Laughter punctuated by the shuffle of cards and clink of beer bottles created a soundtrack of normalcy that would soon be shattered forever. Inside that converted tobacco barn, Lucky Haynes was holding court at his weekly poker game, completely unaware that death was parked 200 yards away, waiting for the right moment to walk through his door. Bobby Carter sat in the passenger seat, his hunting rifle across his lap, staring at the warehouse with the kind of focused intensity their father had taught them to apply to any task worth doing right. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline that comes when a man realizes he's about to cross a line from which there's no return. The brother who'd spent 29 years fixing engines and raising a family was about to become something entirely different. Through gaps in the warehouse siding, they could see the poker table surrounded by 8 men. Lucky Haynes sat with his back to the main entrance, wearing one of his trademark tan suits despite the heat, gold rings catching the light every time he handled cards or chips. Deputy Marcus Webb occupied his usual position to Lucky's right, service revolver visible on his hip even while off duty, a reminder that law enforcement was part of Lucky's protection network. The other 6 were regulars from around the county. Vernon Tucker, who farmed soybeans 3 miles north of the Carter place. Dale Morrison, who'd attended James's wedding and helped with harvests for 15 years. Tommy Briggs, who worked at the same garage as Bobby and shared lunch breaks with him 3 days a week. Men James and Bobby had known their entire lives, men who'd chosen to ignore what Lucky Haynes represented because his money spent the same as anyone else's. At 9:47 that evening, James Carter opened his truck door and stepped onto gravel that crunched under his boots like broken bones. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the humid stillness, but the voices from inside the warehouse continued without pause. Whatever conversation was happening in there, whatever jokes were being told or hands being played, the participants had no idea their world was about to end. Bobby climbed out the passenger side, rifle in hand, moving with the careful precision of a man who understood that every step from this point forward would be scrutinized by investigators, dissected by lawyers, and remembered by families of the dead. The brothers had spent days rehearsing their approach, timing each movement, ensuring they could control the situation before anyone inside realized what was happening. The warehouse had 2 entrances, front and back, with windows set too high in the walls for anyone to escape through quickly. Once the doors were secured, the building would become a trap from which the only exit would be death. James approached the main entrance while Bobby circled toward the rear, their movements coordinated like the military operation this had essentially become. Through the window, James could see more clearly now. Lucky Haynes was dealing cards, that familiar salesman's smile playing across his face as he bantered with the other players. Deputy Webb was laughing at something, his hand resting casually near his weapon, but showing no signs of alertness. The atmosphere was relaxed, convivial even, the kind of easy camaraderie that develops among men who share illegal activities on a regular basis. Vernon Tucker held a winning hand, judging by his expression, while Dale Morrison looked frustrated with his cards. Tommy Briggs was drinking from a beer bottle, completely at ease in surroundings that had become as familiar as his own living room. These were men enjoying themselves, men who believed they were protected by corruption and distance, men who had no conception that justice was about to arrive, wearing the faces of 2 brothers they'd wronged. At 9:51, James Carter turned the handle of the warehouse door. The metal knob felt cold despite the evening heat, solid and final in his grip. Behind him, he could hear Bobby taking position at the rear entrance, the soft scrape of boots on gravel, the last sound of their old lives ending. Everything that came after would belong to different men, harder men, men who'd chosen blood over law when law failed to protect what mattered most. The door swung open on hinges that needed oil, the squeal of metal announcing his presence before anyone inside could see him clearly. 8 faces turned toward the sound, expressions shifting from casual interest to confusion to dawning horror, as they recognized James Carter standing in the doorway with a pistol in his hand and death in his eyes. "Nobody moves," James said, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that comes from a man who's already made peace with what he's about to do. The laughter died instantly, replaced by the kind of silence that follows lightning just before thunder shakes the world. 8 men froze in their chairs, cards forgotten in hands that had begun to tremble, understanding flooding their faces like cold water. "Bobby, lock that back door," James commanded, never taking his eyes off the men around the poker table. The metallic sound of the bolt sliding home echoed through the warehouse like a coffin lid closing, sealing everyone inside with their choices and their consequences. The game was over, but a different kind of reckoning was just beginning. Lucky Haynes found his voice first, that smooth salesman's charm desperately trying to reassert itself, even as sweat began beading on his forehead. "James? Bobby? What's this about? We can talk about whatever's bothering you. Reasonable men can always find solutions that work for everyone." But James Carter was far beyond reason, had moved into territory where only justice mattered, and justice demanded payment in the only currency these men would understand. "We got a problem, Lucky," he said quietly, the .45 steady in his grip. "You destroyed my family, stole our land with legal papers and lies. Every man at this table knew what you did, and not one of you lifted a finger to stop it." Deputy Marcus Webb made the first mistake, reaching for his service weapon with the kind of reflexive motion that had kept him alive through 15 years of law enforcement. But James Carter had spent 13 months in Vietnam, learning to recognize threats before they fully developed, and his response was immediate and final. The shot echoed through the warehouse like thunder, and Marcus Webb fell backward out of his chair, his hand never quite reaching the gun that might have saved him. The sound of gunfire transformed the warehouse from a place of comfortable corruption into something primal and terrifying. Vernon Tucker lunged toward the front door, desperation overriding judgment, but Bobby's rifle spoke from near the back entrance, and Vernon stumbled, fell, and didn't get back up. 2 down in less than 30 seconds, and the remaining 6 men suddenly understood. This wasn't negotiation or intimidation, but execution. Dale Morrison stood up anyway, his face pale with the kind of terror that comes from watching friends die while knowing you're next. "James," he said, his voice cracking with fear and disbelief. "This is insane. You can't just murder people because you're angry about business deals. This won't bring your land back or save your father." But James Carter had moved beyond caring about what was sane or reasonable or legally justifiable. The system had failed his family, and now he was implementing a different system entirely, one where actions had immediate and permanent consequences. The old James who'd believed in law and order was gone, replaced by something that understood only the mathematics of retribution. Dale tried to run toward the back door, calculating distance and hoping Bobby might hesitate to shoot a man he'd known for decades. But Bobby Carter had crossed the same line as his brother, had accepted the same transformation from civilized man to instrument of vengeance. The rifle barked again, and Dale Morrison fell face first onto concrete that would soon be stained with more blood than these walls had ever witnessed. 3 men dead, 5 remaining, and the night was still young. James surveyed the survivors huddled in the corner, where he'd ordered them to move, their faces reflecting the dawning understanding that this wasn't going to stop until everyone who'd participated in his family's destruction had paid the ultimate price. Lucky Haynes, Tommy Briggs, Ray Sutton, Carl Hendricks, and Wayne Palmer pressed against the warehouse wall like cattle sensing the approach of slaughter. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling swayed slightly on its cord, casting moving shadows that made the scene even more nightmarish. The warehouse smelled of tobacco dust and gun smoke and the copper tang of blood, a combination that would haunt the memories of anyone who survived long enough to remember it. But survival wasn't part of James Carter's plan for anyone in that room. "You know why you're here," James said, his voice echoing off concrete walls that had witnessed 50 years of legitimate business before becoming the scene of this calculated massacre. "Every one of you sat at Lucky's table knowing what he'd done to my family. Some of you helped him do it. The rest just looked the other way while a dying man got robbed blind." Tommy Briggs tried to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "James, I didn't have nothing to do with your daddy's land situation. I just came here to play cards, maybe win enough to fix my truck. You know me, man. We work at the same garage. I never meant no harm to your family." But James Carter was beyond such distinctions, had simplified the world into those who'd stood with his family and those who'd stood against them. Everyone else fell into a third category, people whose indifference had enabled evil to flourish unchecked. And in his current state of mind, indifference was just another form of guilt requiring the same punishment. The methodical elimination continued with the precision of a man who'd planned every detail and accepted every consequence. Each shot was deliberate, each death a statement about the price of allowing predators to operate without challenge. The warehouse became an abattoir where decades of corruption and complacency were finally receiving their due payment. By the time the shooting stopped, 11 men lay dead in Turner's warehouse, their blood soaking into concrete floors that would never again host anything resembling normal human activity. James and Bobby Carter stood among the bodies, transformed from farmers into executioners, carrying the weight of choices that would define the rest of their lives. The silence that followed the last gunshot was different from any quiet the Delta had ever known, heavy with finality and consequences that would ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. 11 families would wake tomorrow to discover their worlds had ended, while 2 brothers faced the certainty that their old lives were over, and whatever came next would be measured in concrete cells and steel bars. Outside in the humid Mississippi night, crickets sang their endless chorus, completely indifferent to the carnage that had just unfolded inside Turner's warehouse. The temperature had dropped to 73 degrees, but the air still felt thick enough to choke on. James Carter stood among the bodies, his .45 hanging at his side, waiting for some emotional response that never came. No satisfaction, no horror, no regret. Just a vast emptiness where his conscience used to be. Bobby leaned against the warehouse wall, rifle trembling in his hands as the adrenaline finally began to wear off. The mechanical precision that had carried them through the massacre was giving way to something more human, more fragile. Reality was seeping in like floodwater through a cracked foundation, and with it came the crushing weight of what they'd become. But their work wasn't finished yet. As they prepared to leave, car doors slammed in the gravel parking area outside. 3 more men had arrived late to the game, unaware that death was waiting inside the warehouse walls. Jerry Coleman, 51 years old, had driven down from Yazoo City with his 18-year-old nephew, Michael Dunn. Patrick Walsh, 37, was passing through on his way to Vicksburg and had stopped hoping to join the action. The 3 newcomers approached the warehouse entrance just as James and Bobby emerged, their weapons still in hand, blood spatter visible on their clothing. Recognition flashed across Jerry Coleman's face in the space of a heartbeat. He saw the guns, saw the expressions on the Carter brothers' faces, understood everything with terrible clarity. "Run!" Jerry screamed, but there was nowhere to go. County Road 49 stretched empty in both directions, the nearest house over a mile away. The 3 men scattered on pure instinct, hoping distance might save at least one of them to tell the story of what had happened here. Patrick Walsh sprinted toward the cotton fields, his feet pounding against earth that had been turned and prepared for next year's planting. He made it perhaps 20 yards before Bobby's rifle found him, cutting him down among furrows that would soon be fertilized with his blood. His body fell face first into soil that smelled of chemicals and rain that would never come. Michael Dunn ran toward the tree line, young legs pumping with the desperate speed that comes from understanding you're about to die. Behind him, James Carter gave chase, the older man's Vietnam training keeping him close despite the teenager's natural advantages. When Michael stumbled over a root and fell hard, scrambling to get back up, he looked over his shoulder and saw death approaching with methodical certainty. "Please," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible above his own terrified breathing. "I'm just a kid. I don't even know what's going on in there. I wasn't part of nothing. I just came with my uncle to watch." James Carter looked down at the boy and saw his own son's face reflected back at him, saw every teenager who'd ever been young and scared and caught in circumstances beyond their control. The ice around his heart developed another hairline crack, but it wasn't enough to stop what had already been set in motion. "Wrong place," James said quietly, raising the pistol. "Wrong time." The shot echoed across the cotton fields, carrying the sound of Michael Dunn's life ending to empty spaces where only night birds and insects would bear witness. The 18-year-old fell backward into the dirt, his eyes wide with shock, and lay still among weeds that would grow over his grave before anyone thought to look for him. Jerry Coleman had chosen a different escape route, running back toward the warehouse in some desperate hope of finding shelter or a telephone or some miracle that might save his life. But James caught him at the door, trapping him against the metal siding with nowhere left to run. Jerry spun around, pressing his back against the building's wall, looking at James Carter with the kind of desperate calculation that comes when a man realizes he's facing his final moments. "Listen to me," Jerry said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. "I know you, James. Known you for 15 years. You're not a killer by nature. This isn't who you really are." But Jerry Coleman was wrong. James Carter had discovered something about himself in that warehouse, something that had been sleeping since Vietnam and had finally awakened in response to his family's destruction. He was exactly what this situation had made him, and there was no going back to the man he'd been before Lucky Haynes had stolen everything that mattered. "One survivor," Jerry continued, desperation making him eloquent. "That's all you need to let live. Let me go, and I'll tell them it was self-defense. I'll say Lucky pulled a gun first, that you were protecting yourselves. Give yourself a chance at walking away from this." James looked at the man who'd been his neighbor for a decade and a half, who'd helped him repair fence lines and shared drinks at church socials. Under different circumstances, Jerry Coleman might have been someone worth saving. But circumstances had made such distinctions irrelevant. "This isn't about getting away with it," James said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "This is about making sure everyone knows what happens when you destroy decent families. About sending a message that some men won't go quietly into whatever hole society tries to bury them in." The final shot of the evening echoed off the warehouse walls at 10:52, and Jerry Coleman joined his nephew and Patrick Walsh in death. 11 men had entered Turner's warehouse that Saturday night to play cards and enjoy illegal whiskey. None would see Sunday's sunrise. James Carter stood in the gravel parking area, his weapon finally silent, looking at the warehouse that had become a monument to the night when honor and violence collided in the Mississippi darkness. The building's single light still burned inside, casting shadows through cracks in the siding like fingers reaching out to touch a world that would never again be quite the same. Bobby walked up beside his brother, rifle hanging loose in his grip. Both men breathing hard from exertion and adrenaline and the weight of what they'd accomplished. The transformation was complete now. The farmers who'd entered that building no longer existed, replaced by something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. "It's done," Bobby said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and dawning realization of what their lives would become after this night. "Yeah," James replied, looking toward the eastern horizon where dawn would break in 7 hours and bring with it police cars and federal agents and the end of everything they'd known as free men. "Now we go home. We wait for them to come." They climbed into James's pickup truck, the engine starting with its familiar rumble, headlights cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than before. As they drove away from Turner's warehouse, neither brother spoke about what they'd done or what would happen next. Those conversations belonged to a future that would be measured in concrete cells and steel bars and the endless repetition of institutional time. The drive back to the Carter farmhouse took 12 minutes along roads they'd traveled their entire lives, past fields they'd worked and churches they'd attended, and neighbors who would soon learn that the quiet brothers from down the road had become something out of their worst nightmares. The familiar landscape looked different now, viewed through the eyes of men who'd crossed lines from which there was no return. At 11:03 that Saturday night, they arrived at the house their grandfather had built with his own hands, the porch light burning as it always did, casting its warm glow over a world that had fundamentally changed while appearing exactly the same. Inside, the kitchen still smelled like coffee and old wood, and the accumulated memories of 3 generations who'd believed in doing right even when right was hard. James set his pistol on the kitchen table where he'd eaten breakfast that morning, where his father had taught him about honor and responsibility, where family decisions had been made for over 50 years. The weapon looked alien in such familiar surroundings, a piece of hardware that belonged to battlefields and crime scenes, not to homes where children had once played and mothers had prepared Sunday dinners. Bobby placed his rifle beside the pistol, the two weapons lying across wood that bore the scars of decades of honest use. They stood there in silence, two brothers who'd chosen blood over law when law failed to protect what they held sacred. The weight of 11 lives settled over them like a physical thing, pressing down on their shoulders until breathing became an effort. "How long you think we got?" Bobby asked, his voice barely above a whisper in the quiet house. "Dawn, maybe," James replied, lighting a cigarette with hands that had finally begun to tremble. "Somebody will find them by morning. FB. I will be here by noon." Bobby nodded, walked to the telephone hanging on the kitchen wall, then stopped with his hand on the receiver. The gesture seemed impossibly complex, calling his wife to explain that her husband had become a mass murderer, that their son would grow up visiting daddy in prison, that everything they'd planned and hoped for had died in a warehouse on County Road 49. "What am I supposed to tell Rita?" Bobby asked, his voice cracking with the first real emotion he'd shown since the shooting started. "How do I explain to Sammy that his father killed 11 people because someone stole Grandpa's land?" James walked out onto the back porch, leaving Bobby alone with his impossible phone call. The night air carried the scent of turned earth and distant rain that might never come, the same smells that had greeted Carter men for 3 generations. He sat in his father's chair, the one Samuel had occupied every evening until the emphysema made climbing the porch steps too difficult, and lit another cigarette with hands that wouldn't stay steady. Through the kitchen window, he could hear Bobby's voice, muffled but unmistakably breaking, as he tried to find words for what couldn't be explained, or justified, or undone. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, punctuated by long silences and what sounded like sobbing from both ends of the line. When Bobby finally joined him on the porch, his face was streaked with tears, and his hands shook like he was coming down with fever. They sat together in the darkness, two brothers who'd protected their family's honor by destroying any chance of a normal future, listening to crickets sing and nightbirds call, and the distant sound of 18-wheelers rolling down Highway 49 toward destinations that seemed impossibly far away. Neither man slept that night. They sat on the porch until the eastern sky began to lighten, watching their last sunrise as free men, knowing that within hours, their faces would be on television screens across the state, and their names would become synonymous with the kind of violence that shocked even hardened investigators. At 6:47 Sunday morning, a truck driver named Willie Jameson discovered the bodies at Turner's warehouse while taking a shortcut to avoid highway construction. His radio call brought Sheriff Tom Beckworth, who'd spent Saturday evening at his daughter's birthday party, completely unaware that his jurisdiction had become the scene of the most methodical massacre in Mississippi history. By 7:15, federal agents had been notified. By 8:30, law enforcement vehicles surrounded the Carter farmhouse like circling wolves. James and Bobby walked out with their hands raised, offering no resistance, no final shootout, no desperate attempt to avoid the consequences they'd accepted before firing the first shot. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic after the violence that had preceded it. James Carter submitted to handcuffs with the same stoic dignity he'd shown throughout his adult life, while Bobby cried openly for the family he was leaving behind. Two brothers who'd chosen honor over law when law failed to honor anything that mattered to decent people. As the patrol cars pulled away from the farmhouse, James looked through the rear window at land that had belonged to his family for 55 years and would now belong to strangers who'd never understand what it had cost or why it had mattered enough to kill for. The sun was fully up now, bright and indifferent, beginning another day in a world that had fundamentally changed overnight. Sheriff Beckworth drove in silence, occasionally glancing in his rearview mirror at James Carter, trying to reconcile the quiet man in his back seat with the methodical killer who'd eliminated 11 people in a single evening. The transformation was complete, but somehow invisible, leaving everyone who'd known the Carter brothers struggling to understand how farmers became executioners. By noon, news crews had arrived from Jackson and Memphis, setting up cameras outside the courthouse and interviewing anyone willing to discuss the massacre that had turned rural Mississippi into a war zone. The story would make national headlines within 24 hours, another chapter in America's long history of violence, born from desperation and failed systems. But the deeper story, the one that would never make headlines, was about what happens when ordinary people are pushed beyond all reasonable limits by circumstances they can't control and systems they can't trust. About the terrible mathematics of honor and revenge, where stolen land equals 11 dead, and nobody can agree whether the equation balances. The Carter brothers had crossed a line that civilization draws to separate justice from vengeance, law from violence, protection from destruction. They'd chosen blood over patience, bullets over lawyers, immediate action over long-term consequences. Whether that choice made them heroes or monsters would be debated for decades in courtrooms and coffee shops across the Delta. What couldn't be debated was the finality of what they'd done. 11 families would never be whole again. 2 brothers would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. And Turner's warehouse would stand empty for years, a monument to the night when desperation and honor collided in the Mississippi darkness, leaving nothing but blood and questions and the terrible understanding that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. The investigation that followed would reveal layers of corruption reaching into the highest levels of county government, predatory lending practices that had destroyed dozens of families, and a system so broken that violence had seemed like the only option remaining for men who still believed honor meant something in an increasingly dishonorable world. But justice, when it finally came, would be measured not in restored land or exposed corruption, but in concrete cells and steel bars and the endless repetition of institutional time. The Carter brothers had won their war against Lucky Haynes and lost everything else that mattered, including the souls they'd sacrificed on the altar of family honor. Iced on the altar of family honor. The trial of James Lee Carter and Robert Franklin Carter began on March 18, 1975, in a Jackson courtroom that felt like a theater where the final act of a Greek tragedy was about to unfold. The venue had been moved 200 miles from Yazoo County because finding 12 impartial jurors in a place where everyone had known someone connected to the massacre proved impossible. Rural Mississippi had been divided down the middle by the events of that September night, split between those who saw the Carter brothers as cold-blooded killers and those who understood the desperate mathematics that had driven 2 farmers to become executioners. The prosecution entered the courtroom with the kind of overwhelming evidence that made conviction seem inevitable. Confessions from both defendants, recorded the day of their arrest. Forensic evidence linking their weapons to every crime scene. Shell casings bearing their fingerprints scattered across Turner's warehouse, like breadcrumbs leading directly to their door. A timeline so meticulously documented that it left no room for reasonable doubt about who had pulled those triggers, or when, or why. District Attorney Harold Morrison was 53 years old, a man who'd built his career prosecuting Delta violence, but had never encountered anything quite like this. Standing before the jury, he painted a picture of premeditated mass murder disguised as frontier justice. These weren't desperate men acting in the heat of passion, he argued. These were calculating killers who'd spent 5 days planning systematic execution, acquiring weapons, mapping escape routes, and deciding that 11 human lives were worth less than their wounded pride. The defense, led by court-appointed attorneys who looked overwhelmed from the moment they walked into the courtroom, faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend the indefensible? How do you explain why 2 brothers believed murder was preferable to accepting legal theft? Their strategy centered on temporary insanity, brought on by extreme emotional disturbance, painting James and Bobby Carter as men pushed beyond all reasonable limits by a corrupt system that had failed them at every turn. They called character witnesses who testified that James Carter had been a decorated Vietnam veteran, a man who'd served his country with honor and returned home seeking nothing more than the quiet life of a farmer. Neighbors spoke about Bobby Carter's devotion to his family, his reputation as a skilled mechanic who'd helped anyone in need without expecting payment. These were good men, the defense argued, driven to desperate acts by circumstances that would have broken anyone's spirit. The prosecution methodically destroyed that narrative. Temporary insanity doesn't involve purchasing weapons 3 days before the crime. It doesn't include reconnaissance missions to study the target location. It doesn't encompass the cold calculation required to eliminate witnesses who arrived after the primary killing was complete. This wasn't madness born of unbearable stress. This was revenge, pure and simple, executed with military precision by men who decided they were above the law. The testimony of survivors painted a picture of methodical execution that chilled even seasoned courtroom observers. Deputy Marcus Webb's widow described finding her husband's body, the devastating impact on their teenage daughters, the family's struggle to understand why a man they'd respected had been gunned down while off duty. Lucky Haynes's wife spoke about the predatory loan that had started everything, admitting her husband's guilt while pleading for understanding of the ripple effects his death had created. But the most devastating testimony came from Rita Carter herself, Bobby's wife, who took the stand not to defend her husband, but to describe the man she'd married versus the stranger who'd called her that final Saturday night. Her voice broke as she recounted the phone conversation where Bobby had tried to explain why he wouldn't be coming home, why their 3-year-old son would grow up visiting daddy behind bars, why everything they'd built together had been sacrificed for a principle she couldn't understand. The psychiatric evaluation ordered by the court revealed men who showed no signs of mental illness, no indicators of the kind of psychological break that might justify their actions. James Carter displayed what the examining doctor called moral injury, a condition common among combat veterans who'd been forced to compromise their ethical foundations. But moral injury wasn't legal insanity. It was simply the price some men paid for surviving wars both foreign and domestic. Bobby Carter's evaluation showed a man suffering from what would later be recognized as secondary trauma, the psychological damage that comes from loving someone whose pain becomes unbearable to witness. His devotion to his older brother had transformed normal family loyalty into something destructive, a willingness to follow James anywhere, even into the darkness they'd created together. The jury deliberated for 37 hours across 5 days, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Were the Carter brothers victims of a system so corrupt it left them no choice but violence? Or were they simply men who'd decided that murder was easier than accepting defeat? The legal standard was clear enough. They'd killed 11 people with premeditation and malice aforethought. But the moral questions underlying those deaths proved more complex than any statute could address. On March 27, 1975, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts, both defendants. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of satisfaction and grief, families of the victims finally seeing justice delivered, while supporters of the Carter brothers watched 2 more lives disappear into the machinery of American punishment. James Carter showed no emotion as the verdict was read, his face maintaining the same stoic expression he'd worn throughout the trial. Bobby Carter wept openly, not for himself, but for the family he was leaving behind, for the son who would grow up knowing his father was a killer, for the wife who would raise their child alone while visiting a husband transformed into something she no longer recognized. The tears weren't self-pity, but genuine sorrow for the collateral damage their choices had created. Sentencing came 3 weeks later, and Judge William Harrison delivered the only punishment Mississippi law allowed for such crimes: death by electrocution for both defendants, to be carried out at the state penitentiary in Parchman once all appeals were exhausted. The judge's voice carried no satisfaction as he pronounced the sentences, only the weary recognition that some crimes demand the ultimate penalty, regardless of the circumstances that created them. The death sentences were automatically appealed, beginning a legal process that would stretch across years as attorneys argued over procedural issues, constitutional questions, and the broader implications of executing men who'd committed murder in response to legal theft. The appeals process revealed the systemic corruption that had enabled Lucky Haynes to operate with impunity, but that knowledge couldn't resurrect 11 dead men or restore 2 brothers to their families. In 1978, The death sentences were commuted to life without possibility of parole when the Supreme Court ruled on procedural issues in Mississippi capital punishment cases. James and Bobby Carter would spend the rest of their natural lives behind bars, growing old in concrete cells while carrying the weight of choices that had seemed necessary in September, but felt increasingly heavy as years turned into decades. James Carter was transferred to the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman, where he would spend the next 29 years learning to exist in the space between life and death that defines long-term incarceration. He worked in the prison carpentry shop, teaching other inmates woodworking skills while maintaining the kind of discipline that had served him in Vietnam and on the farm. Guards described him as the quietest prisoner they'd ever supervised, a man who caused no trouble and asked for nothing beyond basic survival. Bobby Carter struggled more with imprisonment, his gregarious nature making solitary existence nearly unbearable. He suffered what prison psychiatrists called an adjustment disorder, a clinical term for the psychological damage that comes from trading family life for institutional routine. Rita visited faithfully for 18 years, bringing Sammy until the boy turned 16 and refused to accompany his mother anymore, unable to reconcile his memories of a loving father with the reality of a man who'd murdered 11 people. The visits became increasingly difficult as Sammy grew older and began asking questions his mother couldn't answer. How do you explain to a teenager that his father had chosen violence over patience, blood over law, immediate action over long-term consequences? How do you help a young man understand that good people sometimes do terrible things when pushed beyond their limits by circumstances that seem to offer no other options? Rita never remarried, though she received several proposals from men who admired her loyalty and understood the loneliness of raising a child alone. She worked double shifts at the local textile plant, saved money for Sammy's education, and maintained the fiction that Daddy was simply away for work rather than locked away for murder. The deception became harder to maintain as news reports occasionally resurfaced the story, reminding everyone in Yazoo County of the night when their neighbors had become killers. Samuel Carter died on October 4, 1974, 3 weeks after the massacre, never knowing what his sons had done in his name. The old man passed away in his hospital bed surrounded by machines that beeped and hissed, his final words reportedly asking about the family land and whether the boys were taking care of themselves. His funeral was sparsely attended, most neighbors uncomfortable associating with a family that had become synonymous with calculated violence. The Carter farmhouse stood empty for 6 years before being sold to distant relatives who had no connection to the tragedy. They attempted to farm the land briefly before discovering that the notoriety made normal agricultural business impossible. Equipment dealers wouldn't extend credit to anyone associated with the Carter name. Grain elevators charged premium rates for storage and transportation. The stigma of mass murder proved more persistent than kudzu, choking off opportunities and making financial survival nearly impossible. In 1981, the property was sold again to an agricultural corporation that razed the farmhouse and combined the acreage with surrounding properties to create an industrial farming operation. Today, the land where 3 generations of Carter men had lived and worked and believed in honor, above all else, produces soybeans for international export, managed by people who have no idea of its blood-soaked history. Turner's warehouse remained standing but abandoned for 24 years after the massacre. No one would rent the building where 11 men had died. Local teenagers occasionally broke in to explore the scene of the county's most notorious crime, finding shell casings overlooked by investigators and graffiti left by previous trespassers. The warehouse became a monument to the night when desperation and honor had collided with such devastating results. In 1998, the building was destroyed by fire of suspicious origin. Investigators suspected arson but never filed charges, understanding that some communities need to burn their most painful memories in order to move forward. The empty lot where Turner's warehouse once stood now grows weeds and wild grass, completely unmarked, except by those old enough to remember what happened there. The broader investigation that followed the massacre revealed corruption reaching into the highest levels of Yazoo County government. Lucky Haynes had been operating under protection that extended far beyond Deputy Marcus Webb's willingness to look the other way. Bank officials had been taking kickbacks to approve questionable loans. County assessors had been manipulating property values to facilitate transfers. The entire system, designed to protect property rights, had been perverted into a machine for stealing from the most vulnerable residents. But even as the corruption was exposed and several officials faced prosecution, the reforms that followed proved largely cosmetic. New regulations were written to prevent the specific abuses that had destroyed the Carter family, but the underlying conditions that created such vulnerability remained unchanged. Rural Mississippi continued to struggle with predatory lending, corrupt officials, and economic pressures that pushed desperate people toward desperate choices. The psychological impact of the massacre extended far beyond the immediate families involved. Yazoo County experienced what trauma specialists would later recognize as collective post-traumatic stress, a community-wide condition created when violence shatters the basic assumptions that hold society together. Neighbors began viewing each other with suspicion, wondering who might be capable of similar acts when pushed too far. The easy trust that had characterized rural relationships gave way to careful wariness that persisted for decades. Churches struggled to provide spiritual guidance for events that seemed to transcend normal categories of sin and redemption. How do you counsel forgiveness when 11 families have been destroyed? How do you preach about justice when the legal system had so obviously failed? Pastor after pastor found themselves grappling with theological questions that had no satisfactory answers, forced to acknowledge that sometimes good and evil become so intertwined that separation proves impossible. The national media attention that followed the trial transformed the Carter brothers from local criminals into symbols of broader American anxieties about rural decay, systemic corruption, and the breakdown of traditional values. Magazine articles analyzed their actions through various lenses, finding in their story reflections of everything from post-Vietnam trauma to the death of family farming to the corruption of the American dream itself. But the symbolic interpretations missed the fundamental reality of what had happened. Two men had been pushed beyond their limits by circumstances they couldn't control and had chosen violence over acceptance. The broader meaning could be debated endlessly, but the core truth remained simple and terrible. When systems fail and desperation takes hold, some people will cross lines that civilized society considers uncrossable, leaving destruction that ripples outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. James Carter died on November 3, 2003, at age 63, victim of a massive heart attack in the prison infirmary. His final words, according to the chaplain on duty, were questions about his father and whether Samuel had ever learned what they'd done in his name. The chaplain couldn't provide answers because some questions transcend human understanding, reaching into territory where only grief and regret and the weight of irreversible choices exist. Bobby Carter remains incarcerated at Parchman as of this recording, now 79 years old and suffering from the various ailments that come with growing old in captivity. Sammy visits twice a year, maintaining connection to a father he barely remembers outside prison walls, bringing photographs of grandchildren who will never know their grandfather as anything other than a cautionary tale about the price of choosing violence over patience. The story of the Carter brothers and the massacre at Turner's warehouse serves as a stark reminder that the line between victim and perpetrator can be thinner than we want to believe. These weren't men who woke up one morning and decided to become killers. They were farmers pushed beyond their breaking point by a system that had stopped protecting the people it was designed to serve. Men who believed that honor was worth dying for, and more dangerously, worth killing for. Their tale forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and revenge, about the price of protecting family honor, about what happens when legal channels fail and desperation takes hold. It reminds us that monsters aren't always born, but sometimes made, shaped by circumstances that test the limits of human endurance and moral flexibility. And once those limits are exceeded, once those lines are crossed, the transformation proves irreversible, leaving only the terrible mathematics of blood and consequences to mark what was lost and what was gained in the darkness. The Mississippi Delta carries its secrets in silence, burying truth beneath layers of cotton and time until only whispers remain. 50 years have passed since that September night when two brothers transformed from farmers into executioners. Yet the questions they raised continue echoing through forgotten corners, where justice and vengeance blur into something unrecognizable. Their story serves as a brutal reminder that ordinary men, when stripped of everything they hold sacred, can become capable of extraordinary darkness. Today, the land where Samuel Carter once grew soybeans produces crops for faceless corporations that know nothing of the blood that fertilized that soil. The farmhouse where 3 generations lived and died and believed in honor above profit has been erased, replaced by industrial agriculture that measures success in tonnage rather than legacy. Progress, they call it, though some would argue that forgetting such lessons constitutes regression of the most dangerous kind. Bobby Carter's grandson, now 23 years old, works as an electrician in Memphis, carrying a surname that still opens old wounds in certain circles of rural Mississippi. He knows the story, understands the weight of inherited shame, yet struggles with the same questions that have haunted his family for half a century. Was his grandfather a hero who stood up to corruption when no one else would? Or was he simply a killer who dressed murder in the language of justice? The questions remain, hanging in the humid Delta air like morning fog that never quite burns away. When systems fail and law becomes a weapon wielded by predators against the innocent, what are decent people supposed to do? The Carter brothers answered with blood, choosing vengeance over patience, bullets over justice, immediate action over long-term consequences. Their choice destroyed 11 families and left a scar on rural Mississippi that time hasn't healed. Whether they were desperate men pushed too far, or cold-blooded killers who wrapped murder in honor's clothing, depends on which side of that warehouse door you're standing on. The only certainty is this: when civilization's thin veneer cracks, what lies beneath can shock us all.